today's show with your host, Louise Bubron Macaluso.
Welcome everyone to Hope for Today. We have a great show for you today. Here with me is Dr. Kirby Reuter. Hi Kirby, welcome.
Hi, Louise. Thank you so much. It's so good to be back.
Yes, oh my goodness. Yes, we've been working on getting you back so we could revisit the topic we talked about last time.
Yep, I am looking forward to the opportunity.
Yes, so just as a refresher, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Sure, my name is Kirby Reuter. I am a clinical psychologist. I contract full time with the Department of Homeland Security to provide mental health treatment services for asylum seekers.
Right.
As probably everyone knows, the border crisis makes national headlines just about every day.
Right,
So I'm
exactly.
kind of on the front lines of a lot of that.
Right, and so you are swamped with work, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yes. So last time we talked about the five stages or themes surrounding trauma. So we're gonna start with that. So the first one is
Yeah, so like we mentioned before, there's five basic themes of brain development that I would like to go over, if that's okay.
yeah.
So just really quickly, the five themes are first of all, the brain develops in a very specific order, but in addition to that, each stage of brain development affects the next stage. So if everything goes as it should, that's a really good foundation for subsequent brain development.
Right.
But if anything goes haywire at one stage, that is going to have a ripple effect down the line.
Right. Yes. So there's a hierarchy of, the different stages.
Yeah.
One precedes the other.
Exactly. But not only that, not only does the brain develop in a very specific order, but the brain also processes all current incoming information in that same exact order.
Right.
So if brain development has been altered at any point during childhood, that affects how we currently process information now as adults.
Yes.
Yeah. And another theme is that the brain tends to focus more on unfinished business than finished business.
Right.
But then finally, the last theme is that the brain is not set in stone. So even if brain development did not go as it should, that doesn't mean that the brain has to stay that way the rest of the individual's life. There are treatments available nowadays that can kind of reshape brain development.
Right, kind of tweak it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we could let's talk about like each phase a little bit. So the first phase of the brain development. Um, so when someone is faced with trauma, what does that have? What kind of effect does that have on the brain?
Sure. So there are four basic stages, or maybe phases is a better term, of brain development. The very first phase of all is when the survival brain develops. So the survival brain is what drives everything we do automatically, such as digestion or respiration or circulation, etc. But the survival brain also drives our instinctual response to danger or crisis. And we have three basic responses to danger or crisis, and that is fight, flight, or freeze. So if a child is growing up in a healthy, stable, affirming environment, that child's survival brain will be relatively contained.
Right.
Because even when that survival brain is triggered, and it will be, of course, but there's a supportive caregiver that can help that child co-regulate their survival brain, because they don't have the skills yet to regulate the survival brain on their own, but they learn those skills when there's a supportive caregiver that's helping them. But in the case of a child that's experiencing chronic trauma, their survival brain is not contained. Their survival brain is not being co-regulated by a supportive caregiver. If anything, it's constantly being triggered over and over and over again. And therefore, since that survival brain is being overworked, it overdevelops,
Right.
including that fight, flight, freeze response.
Yeah.
And it's that overdevelopment of that fight, flight, freeze response early on that has a ripple effect on the following stages of brain development.
Right. And one of the things that the fight, flight, or freeze aspect of it is, one example that I can give is a lot of the times you see kids who are abducted and they become like pretty much they get to a freeze stage where they end up like just like giving in to the situation, and they might even just like start building a rapport with the abductor.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, the reason that happens is because, well, just in simple terms, we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is
Right.
sort of like an accelerator, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of like a brake. And we need
Mhm.
both, right? If you're driving down the highway,
Yeah.
sometimes you need to accelerate, sometimes you need a brake, but
Mhm.
sometimes there's danger ahead, and you need to either slam on the accelerator to get around the danger or slam on the brake so you don't crash. Well,
Yeah.
slamming on the accelerator is like fight or flight, right? That's
Mhm.
super activation of the sympathetic nervous system, right? The
Mhm.
sympathetic nervous system is already, the whole point is already to accelerate, but sometimes we need to accelerate even more. That's fight or flight. But sometimes we cannot escape a situation, sometimes we cannot fight back, right? If we try to fight
Right.
back, it would get even worse. If we try to escape, well, we can't. Or if we did, it would get even worse. So therefore, when we can't accelerate, we have to brake. And the
Right.
freeze response is like slamming on the brake. You just
Mhm.
freeze,
Just freeze completely. Yeah.
shut
And
down. Yep.
in those situations, that term developed,
Mm-hmm.
the Stockholm disorder or effect, where they end up like developing a um, nurturing feeling for the abductor. And so even if they get rescued, I read an article not too long ago of a teenager who got abducted, and even when she was rescued, she was still trying to get in touch with the abductor. So she developed some kind of um, relationship, or some kind of sympathetic feeling for that abductor.
Yeah, absolutely. And that speaks to one of the later stages of development, which is the attachment brain.
Hmm.
Um, but so if we go back to the survival brains, like I mentioned, that's the first stage of development.
Hmm.
But then the next stage of development after that is the emotion brain. And so if the survival brain is calm, it's contained, it's co-regulated by a supportive caregiver, that's a really good foundation for the emotion brain to develop,
Right.
including and especially a full spectrum of emotions, both negative and positive, right? Because
Yeah.
we need a full emotional repertoire to deal with life.
Yeah.
But if that survival brain has been overdeveloped, in particular fight, flight, freeze, that does affect the emotion brain
Hmm.
in at least two important ways. One way is that positive emotions become underdeveloped. And think about, well, why would that be? Well, that's because you don't really need positive emotions to execute fight, flight, or freeze.
Right.
In fact, if anything, positive emotions might be perceived as dangerous, right? So, for example, if I loved my daddy or I loved my mommy, but they were the ones abusing me, well, then maybe love's not such a good idea. So,
Yeah.
but while positive emotions are underdeveloping, negative emotions are overdeveloping. And why is that? Well, because you do need those negative emotions to execute fight, flight, and freeze. In two in particular, fear and anger. So what we
Hmm.
see in traumatized children is not only does the survival brain become overdeveloped with fight, flight, freeze, but positive emotions become underdeveloped, negative emotions become overdeveloped, and especially fear and anger,
Yeah.
which once again is going to have a ripple effect on subsequent brain development.
Yes, exactly. And in that phase also, that can be seen later on in life as well, where like the negative emotions kind of over outweigh the positive ones. and as adults later on they might be not so willing to have like a positive relationship where there is love, where there is trust. They are afraid of that, literally.
Yep, no, you're absolutely right. Um, so the next stage of brain development after the emotion brain is the attachment brain. And if you think about it, the order here is very logical because you need lots of emotions to navigate relationships. Relationships are complex, they're nuanced. You need a full spectrum of emotions. However, if you only have fear and anger to work with, that's just not enough emotional tools to develop solid relationships and attachments. So therefore, the attachment brain becomes overdeveloped. So in the case of traumatized children, what that means is they will either just not develop attachments, period, or very impoverished attachments. Those kind of shy away from people. They'll burn bridges that they can't really afford to burn, but they don't trust people. Or what can also happen is they'll overcompensate for that underdeveloped attachment brain and over rely on people.
Right. Yeah.
And idealize people, right?
Yeah.
Put people on a pedestal, kind of have this what's called this fantasy bond. It's almost like an imaginary attachment. And that's one of the explanations for that Stockholm syndrome that you mentioned, because kids need attachments to survive. They know that, and if there isn't an attachment, well, then they make one up. What other choice do they have? And if the only attachment you have is with an abuser, well, then so be it. Because kids know they need attachments to survive.
Right, exactly. And that's why those formative years are so vital, because like this is where they learn about all those different aspects of life in terms of attachment, positive emotions, and all that. So if unfortunately they were not given that opportunity to experience positive emotions, so it's almost it's not impossible, but it's going to be a very difficult adulthood for them.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And one of the reasons for that is because the last stage of brain development is when the cognition brain develops.
Right.
And so this is the part of the brain that does the thinking. So this is the part of the brain that develops beliefs, right, about self, about others, about the world. This is also the part of the brain that makes decisions based on factors such as cause and effect and pros and cons, short-term versus long-term, all of that. But here's the deal. If brain development has been smooth up to this point, well, the survival brain is contained, motion brain has a nice spectrum of emotions, and there's very secure attachments. Well, all of that is a really good foundation for a solid thinking brain, right? A thinking brain that's going to have positive beliefs about the self, others, in the world. That's thinking brain that's going to have sound decision making.
Yeah.
But if previous brain development is out of whack, then the person won't develop that sort of a thinking brain. Instead, the person will develop a thinking brain characterized by negative beliefs about self, others, and the world. And that makes complete sense. That has been their world up to this point.
Right.
But also including impulsive decision making. And if you think about it, that's highly adaptive because they have had to react impulsively to survive up to this point.
Right.
They haven't had the luxury to sit around and contemplate some kind of imaginary future when their life is at risk right now.
Right. So they are in constant survival mode.
Exactly. That's a really good way of putting it. And if you think about it, that attachment brain is absolutely crucial to developing a solid thinking brain, because that's how kids learn. Kids learn primarily through relationships with others, and especially their caregivers at first, and then later on through peers. Kids don't learn how to think well, make good decisions in a bubble, right? As healthy, functioning adults, we can learn to make some pretty good decisions on our own, although we still need others, of course. But with kids, that's absolutely essential.
It is, yes. And a lot of the times, like, unfortunately, parents don't realize the effect they have on their children because, like, this is how they learn through modeling
Exactly.
how they supposed to behave, how they supposed to think, how they perceive things and people around them, and how they perceive even themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, just to kind of summarize
Hmm.
what we've been talking about. So what we see in traumatized children is fight, flight, and freeze becomes overdeveloped in that survival brain. But then positive emotions become underdeveloped. Then negative emotions become overdeveloped. Attachments become underdeveloped. Negative beliefs become overdeveloped. And decision making becomes underdeveloped.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? So you have this, up and down, up and down.
Yeah.
So either too much or too little
Yeah.
of what should have happened. And then as these children become adults, that's actually how all incoming information is perceived. So incoming information jumps through those same hoops. So when information first hits our senses, and then it gets processed in our brain, right, all before we know what's going on. So when incoming information hits our senses, it then gets distorted through fight, flight, freeze, and then negative emotions, and then negative beliefs.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Because that's why I love psychology because that helps you understand a lot of situation when you are faced with someone who is deemed difficult. A lot of the times, it's someone who's had that kind of experience and they don't know how to process information correctly. And so that becomes they go through the same those same phases of just like survival mode, negative emotions, negative reactions to things, and so it becomes really complicated. But like if we were to understand the human psyche, I think it would be a lot easier for us to work together and collaborate and interact.
Yep. Amen to that. I totally
Yeah,
agree with you.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
So,
it's
so,
go
so
ahead.
all of that probably sounds like doom and gloom, right? Because trauma does affect brain development,
Mm,
and brain development does affect us not only as kids but as adults.
right,
And really that should be sobering.
right,
But like I mentioned earlier, the brain is not set in stone, right? The brain is malleable.
right.
The brain has plasticity. There's also this phenomenon called post-traumatic growth.
Hmm.
So what that basically means is the brain can learn and grow in new directions and even learn new insights precisely as a result of the trauma that it couldn't have learned otherwise.
Right,
Right? So there
exactly.
is kind of a silver lining behind all of this.
There is. Yes, I actually talk about post-traumatic growth in one of my books because like this is something that I personally experienced myself, and so yes, I can attest to
Agreed.
that.
Same here. I
Yeah,
can too. That's why I'm a
right?
psychologist.
Yeah, exactly. Because we always have like as psychologists, we usually have a story. That's what
Yep.
usually lead us to toward that that field
Yep.
because you learn through your trauma, your experiences, and get some really good insights that make you who you are in the long run,
Yep.
which is
Totally agree.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. My entire career in psychology is an example of post-traumatic growth.
yeah,
Yeah. But
and
here's the deal with post-traumatic growth and healing in general. It's not a guarantee. So it's not like we should go around traumatizing people just so they can learn new
right,
insights. Because the trauma itself obviously is excruciatingly
right,
painful,
exactly. Yeah, some
but
impact.
so is the healing process. The
Yeah,
healing process is also painful.
yes,
And so, and not everyone experiences post-traumatic growth.
no,
There have to be certain circumstances, certain conditions in
right,
place for that to happen. So I like to see healing from trauma, post-traumatic growth. In other words, rewiring the brain as an adult. I like to see all that like learning a new language,
Right.
which for anyone that's tried that, it's really, really hard.
Yeah.
So, for children that are fortunate enough to experience very nurturing childhoods, their brain development is sort of like learning their own native language. It's
Yeah.
pretty much effortless.
Hmm.
Um, so, when your brain is wired in all the ways it should be wired, it's sort of like being exposed to your native language. And you learn the words, you learn the vocabulary, you learn the syntax, you even learn the grammar, even very complex grammar automatically.
Yeah. It
Um,
just flows.
yes, but when your brain did not develop exactly how it should have under ideal conditions, and then as an adult, you're learning these skills that will literally create new connections at the synapses and create new wiring. It can be done, but it's like learning another language from scratch, which is hard.
Right.
You're learning all of these new words in this complex grammar, but now it's not automatic anymore. It's sort of like studying Spanish in high school or French
Right.
in college. It's
Right.
hard work.
Yes,
Now you
exactly.
have to start thinking about subject verb agreement and conjugations and gender and neutral. And it's like, what? You didn't have to think
Yeah.
about any of this in your own language, but now you do.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great analogy too, in terms of like, learning a new language, because like different languages have different ways of translating
Hmm.
from English to French. And so I totally get it, because it's true. It's like how you say something in English is put completely differently in French.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's like a whole reframing of the way you see and understand things.
Hmm. Yeah, and just like learning another language as an adult is creating all kinds of new connections and all kinds of
Hmm.
growth in your brain, that's what it's like to learn the skills to recover from trauma and to
Right.
rewire the brain. It can be done,
Okay.
but it's going to be hard work. And that person might speak with an accent, so to speak,
Yes,
right? In other
in
words,
the beginning.
their brain won't necessarily be completely rewired the way it
Right.
would have been precisely if they had experienced ideal conditions.
Right. It's gonna take some effort and some willingness on the part of the person to want to do it, and just like, yes, but they will feel somewhat uncomfortable when they
Yeah,
are, applying
yeah,
those new terms, those new way of thinking
yeah,
into their
absolutely.
lives.
Yeah, and just to continue that analogy a little bit further, so when you do learn a new language as an adult, I mean, you learn to see the world in a completely new way, right? You have a whole new
Right.
vocabulary, you have a whole new perspective, right?
Yeah.
Learning a new language opens up a whole new world, and that's kind of what recovering from trauma is like. It's like
Hmm.
you're seeing the world from a completely different perspective, and that I think that explains a lot of post traumatic growth. Your brain has now grown in these amazing ways that it wouldn't have grown otherwise. Like for
Yeah.
example, I learned Spanish as an adult, and so that has opened up a whole new world of opportunity for me.
Right.
So that's what it's like recovering from trauma. It's you just your brain is just growing and making connections in so many amazing ways.
Yes, exactly. And then in the beginning, it's gonna be hard. It's gonna feel uncomfortable, just like when
Yeah.
you learn a new language. When you're speaking that language in the beginning, it's like it takes an effort on your part. It's like, you have to think about what you're saying and all that. Because I've experienced that when I first moved here, and like, when I'm speaking in French or in Creole, like it was like it just flowed. But like in the beginning when I was speaking English, it was like it took some effort. I had to
Yeah.
think about like each word, how I place the verbs and all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So it's gonna be the same for when you are starting to reframe your way of thinking, your way of doing things. But after, like, after a while, you get the hang of it, and it
Yeah.
becomes easier and easier as you continue to to adapt to that new lifestyle.
Yep, absolutely. And your English is absolutely perfect now. So
I
congratulations
know,
on that.
thank
I
God.
know how hard that is to learn another language.
I know, right? And so that's the beautiful thing because like before I had to think about it when I'm like, speaking English, but now it's like it's just I speak it as well as I speak French or Creole. So it's yeah, so it's possible for us to kind of reframe our way of thinking, our psyche.
Yep, I completely agree with that.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just amazing. So the last one, that was the cognitive development, the last phase.
Yeah, we have the survival brain, we have the emotion brain, we have the attachment brain, we have the cognition brain. Those are the
Right.
kind of the four major stages of brain development.
Yeah. So I feel like the cognitive brain development is just so important. Like I mean, all of them are, but because like everything we think like has an effect on how we behave, how we respond to things. I think it's very important that we develop that, like that the cognitive brain in a positive way. That is,
Yeah, no, for sure. Um, most of us already have kind of built in what's called this negativity bias, right?
right?
So most of us already see the world in more negative terms than it actually is.
Yeah,
And a lot of that's adaptive, right? Because, you know, so one way we have this negativity bias is that the brain favors false alarms over no alarms.
right,
Because if there's no alarm at all of danger, well, we just might die.
right,
But the brain also fires off lots of false alarms because the brain it doesn't know it's a false alarm. It could be a
right.
real alarm.
Yeah,
Um, and another way that we have this negativity bias is that the brain also learns much more quickly from negative events than positive events, right?
right,
Because we don't have the luxury of learning too many times from something that's potentially lethal, right? You
right.
better learn that very fast.
Yeah, exactly.
So
And
we
so,
have this kind of this built-in negativity bias just at our baseline. But if you've been
mhm,
traumatized, you have much more of a negativity bias than
right, exactly. So that becomes the norm for that person. The
absolutely.
negative bias and all that, so that becomes the norm. So
Yeah,
it's a big adjustment to go from the negative bias to like, reframing your way of thinking.
yeah, yeah. And that negativity bias permeates, all of those stages of brain development. It affects the survival brain, affects the emotion brain, affects the attachment brain, affects the cognition brain. There's just, this extra layer of negativity that
Yeah.
permeates all of those stages.
Yes, exactly. Because, in psychology, we have cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses especially on, how your thinking affects your behavior. And so that's why I was saying earlier that it's so important because that plays such a major role in everything that we do and how we interact with others and
Yeah,
our decision making. So it's like it's really important for us to be able to have a hold of like, our way of thinking.
yeah. No, I totally agree with that. And to take that a step further, I would also like to make the case that, to heal a traumatized brain, really we need to heal each of those four levels. So,
Yeah.
some models such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, focus more on the cognitive brain, by
Hmm.
definition. And that's called, top-down processing, when we focus on this part of the brain. Um, but there's also many treatments out there that help to stabilize the survival brain,
Right.
right? Or help to bolster that emotion brain,
Hmm.
or help to cultivate that attachment brain.
Yes.
Because we need all four parts of the brain
Hmm.
to work together.
Yes. They all have to be in shape in order for us to, to be able to cope with life.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's hard to change your thinking when you constantly have fight, flight, and freeze firing from the back of the brain,
Right, exactly. It's
or
like
when
that
you
constant.
have constant fear and anger coming from the emotion brain, or you
Yeah.
have I can't trust you coming from the attachment brain.
Yes, exactly. So it's like it's a complete like it's sort of like a war zone,
Yeah,
in your brain because it's like so much is happening at once, and so and I think that's why a lot of the times people end up snapping. Um, when you realize how the brain works and when all of that is going on at once and the person doesn't have the tools to in terms of dealing with what's going on in their brain. So then you understand a lot about when you hear certain stories or certain news, um, where they saying like, someone did this, and you understand. You try to get it from that perspective, from a psychological perspective.
yeah. I really like that analogy of the brain being at war with itself.
Right.
I think that is a very eloquent description of a traumatized brain that hasn't been healed yet.
Yeah.
That's still dealing with unresolved trauma.
Yes, exactly. And so that's why it's important. I feel that everyone needs to kind of be in touch with all of that. And I know that there's always like a stigma attached to seeking mental health, but it's so vital in terms of us being able to handle life in general.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there's if your arm is broken, there's no stigma going to the
Right,
ER and
exactly,
getting a
right?
cast or getting an X-ray. So it just, in my opinion, it's silly that we're still at a point in society in
Yeah,
which there's a stigma around taking care of our emotions and taking care of our
yeah.
mind.
Exactly. It's just like complete. It's just so ridiculous. It's necessary. Just like we need to see a doctor, like you said, for a broken arm. You need to be able to see someone and be able to just like find out what's going on and process it and find ways to handle it in a more productive way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we covered a lot in terms of trauma and brain development. Oh, I forgot to ask you to let everyone know about the books that you have written.
Well, one of the books I've written is specifically for trauma recovery. It's
Yeah.
basically it's a skills book. It's a
Mhm.
DBT skills book. DBT stands for dialectical behavioral therapy,
Mhm.
and it's specifically it's skills that are designed actually to to help people heal from each of these four brains if they've
Yes.
somehow been damaged by trauma.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so I that one is like really good in terms of like, for psychologists, everyone working in the mental health field, it's a great one to check out and get some good tips. Where can they find your book, Kirby?
Oh, they can find that on Amazon. So if they just do a search for DBT for trauma, Dr. Kirby Reuter, that's Reutter, published by New Harbinger, they should be able to find it, no problem.
Perfect. Yes, and in your other books too, they will be able to find that as well.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it was amazing. I'm glad we got to revisit that topic, Kirby.
I know we've been playing phone tag a little bit here, but we finally
Right?
connected.
Yes, finally. So I'm glad we got to do that.
Likewise, I really
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I want to remind everyone that the episodes are archived on the station's website. If you want to revisit, rewatch it, so feel free to do so. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much, Kirby, for being my guest.
Thanks for for having me, and I hope this repeats someday.
Yes, definitely. We'll be back. I'll have Kirby back with us again for another topic. So stay tuned, guys. It's gonna be a good one.
Great, I can't wait.
Yes. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Louise Bobron Macaluso. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Hope for today's show with your host, Louise Bubron Macaluso.